Alright, young historians, welcome back to Chapter 19. Here is part 2 of the lecture. So the first topic up here is going to be racial issues. Race is going to take a back seat to other areas of reform during the Progressive Era, but there will still be figures on the national stage advocating for racial equality and advocating for a rollback and abolishment of Jim Crow laws and advocating for just equal treatment of Black Americans. One of these characters is going to be Ida Wells, or Ida Wells Barnett, after she gets married. She, in particular, is going to try to shine a spotlight on the problem of lynching in the South. Definitely make sure that you're familiar with her name and her works. W.E.B. Du Bois is also going to be a big name at this point in time. He is a little bit younger than Booker T. Washington, and he's also often seen as a little bit more radical, or at least a little bit more idealistic. Whereas Booker T. Washington was viewed by some as too accommodationist of segregation, too willing to put up with segregation in the here and now for the sake of maybe achieving social equality later, Du Bois is going to say that to accept a position of inferiority to ever compromise on morality is not going to be acceptable, full stop, period, no matter what. So Du Bois is seen as a little bit more radical than Washington. Du Bois is part of the Niagara Movement, which helps to form the NAACP. Du Bois is also the first Black American to achieve a PhD from Harvard University. And there's this quote of his right after he achieves the PhD. He says, "The honor, I assure you, was Harvard's," which I think is just fantastic. Just the sass there is just fantastic, phenomenal. As far as progressive presidents go, none of the progressive presidents will take a strong stand on race. Theodore Roosevelt, you might recall, invited Booker T. Washington and his family to dine at the White House, but he doesn't do a whole lot for the Black community. Taft doesn't do a whole lot either, and Wilson certainly does, I think, less than either of those two. Federal service is going to segregate under Wilson's eye. Federal employment will segregate, and Wilson will also show the birth of a nation in, I believe, 1913 or 1914 in the White House. And the Birth of a Nation film we're talking about here is not the one that came out a few years ago, but the Birth of a Nation from a little over a century ago now that glorifies the KKK and glorifies the role of white supremacy in trying to shape the South after the Civil War. And so, of course, showing that at the White House, it's kind of a darker moment in presidential history. Wilson is definitely not racially progressive. He's certainly no friend to Black Americans. And you'll have to forgive my house. The furnace just turned back on. If it starts to make a really loud noise like a chainsaw, I promise you that I'm not being murdered. We had somebody try to come fix it a couple hours ago, and it should be fixed, but it has not started up until about 10 seconds ago. So forgive me if this lecture gets really loud all of a sudden, and I promise that I'm not about to be murdered. So, anyways, next point, challenging capitalism, socialists and wobblies. Socialism runs far back in American history, but it never goes really deep. Even people like Eugene Debs, who's the most popular socialist at the time, in 1912 he polls, 6% of popular votes for president. It's never really a formidable force that we have to face, but they certainly do give people in both parties something to talk about. Eugene Debs, we've not seen the last of him. He's going to run for president right after World War I, and we'll talk about what a spectacle that is when we get there. The Wobblies, the IWW, the International Workers of the World, are more of a socialist type of union. Their goal is to bring together unskilled and semi-skilled laborers and then call a general strike and basically bring the country to a grinding halt. That's how they plan to force employers to the bargaining table. And their ultimate goal, of course, is socialism, is worker ownership of the means of production, or indeed even government ownership of monopolies, I think is also how it's phrased in terms of Debs's goals. And again, stay tuned for World War I for the Wobblies. There's a couple stories that we'll tell there, the Bisbee lockout, things like that. So there's never really a groundswell of support for socialism, but it certainly does give Americans of all flavors and all parties something to talk about. And if anything, it becomes sort of this spectacle, and its influence might be over-exaggerated. Certainly its threat is over-exaggerated by its opponents. We'll come back to socialism in the Red Scare, the first Red Scare after World War I too. The moral of the story here, folks, is stay tuned for World War I when it comes to socialism. Moving on, the reform of politics and the politics of reform. Muckrakers, and they're given this title, I think it's Theodore Roosevelt who tries to derisively apply this quote about raking the muck, and the muckrakers take it and run with it. They don't really choose to interpret it as an insult. But their goal is to expose corruption, to rake the muck, to expose it to sunlight, to try to shine a spotlight on what is going wrong so that there is popular support for trying to fix social ills. Journalists will play an important role in preparing the ground for reform, even if some of what they print is kind of sensationalistic. See that article that I posted about the Mann Act, if you're curious about that. McClure's Magazine, Ladies' Home Journal are going to be some examples of media that is part of the muckraking movement. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is probably the most famous book to come out of the muckraker movement, though, to come out of progressivism. There's an excerpt in the comments on this slide if you download it. It's pretty disgusting. Don't read it if you're squeamish or if you just ate. It's pretty disgusting. I think you should read it just because it's part of history, but that's just me. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act will flow out of this increased concern for what is in our food. Is it what it says it is, and is it ultimately safe for me to consume? Is my whiskey safe for me to drink? Is my medicine safe for me to take? Is my food safe for me to feed to my children? There's an excerpt in the chapter, a special feature about the reductive fallacy, wherein historians will sometimes try to just boil something down to having one cause where perhaps there's actually many causes. Historians in decades past used to think the Pure Food and Drug Act came from this groundswell of support after the publishing of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and it's really not that simple. The Jungle inspired the Meat Inspection Act. It did not really have an impact on the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, and if you go back and read that section, you'll see exactly why. Definitely read that, though, young historians. There's some really great meat in there for how to think historically, and what questions to ask, and what evidence to consider, so totally recommend that. Reforming city and municipal government is our next point here. The goal is to make city government honest and efficient and effective, and it's this pushback against political machines that we've seen emerge in previous chapters. How do we make city government fairer for everybody, and for everybody who lives in a city, and ultimately fair all across the city, so that politics is not just focusing on fixing some people's problems or issues in one part of the city, and how do we make sure the corruption is not playing a hand in municipal government? We see progressives focusing on solving those problems. How do they do that? They restructure. There's a couple different ways that they can choose to run a city, who's in charge of decision-making and allocating funding. They can practice public planning. They can also have a focus on public health. What sort of initiatives will they develop? I know your chapter talks about eradicating tuberculosis and hookworm. We see the application of scientific knowledge and inquiry, the application of expertise in trying to solve these problems, and that's one fantastic outcome, I think, of the progressive era. We've also got Robert La Follette, who's going to have the Wisconsin idea under his belt. La Follette, of course, from Wisconsin, is going to advocate for things like the direct primary, wherein people will directly elect their representatives, and the merit system, where you're not awarded a job in the government based on patronage, based on how you supported a candidate during election, but rather you're given this job because of your capability, your training, and your previous experience. That's the merit system. The Wisconsin idea, which seeks to just make government more effective, more efficient, more honest, will be copied in other states, such as Iowa. It'll be copied later in California, and people like Hiram Johnson of California are going to be pretty famously associated with these ideas. The weakening of parties and the rise of organized interest groups is another big part of progressivism. The Oregon system, which included the initiative and the referendum, is one big example of this. The initiative is the ability of voters to suggest that something become law, or at least suggest that it become, that something be put in front of legislators at the next legislative round, and the referendum is the ability for voters to reject a law that has already been adopted. Make sure you're familiar with both of those progressive era reforms. And the third one here is the recall. Recall is the ability of everyday people to vote in an election cycle on whether they should remove politicians from public office. So the initiative, referendum, and recall are three things you should definitely take away from this. Moving on, here we get to Theodore Roosevelt, a little bit more of his presidency. So he's going to transform the office of the president dramatically. He and Wilson both will. Theodore Roosevelt is going to use the presidency as sort of a bully pulpit to shine a light on what he thinks needs to be done, and in his view, the president should do what is good for the nation as long as the Constitution and other laws on the books do not prohibit him from doing so. He definitely takes more of a loose constructionist approach to the presidency, to borrow that term from the 1790s when it was so big for us. He saw political office really as a duty that he owed the nation, and his goal was to be the most effective president he could in advancing America's varied interests. His personality and his way of doing business is just fantastic, and like I have on here, he's got swag. I know I'm not cool enough to use that word, but just grant me this one slang term for once, and I think that you'll agree with me at the end of this, that he really is cool enough to maybe merit that term. So his views on trusts, are they good or bad? Theodore Roosevelt thinks that as long as a trust is operating in the general public interest, and as long as the trust accepts the supremacy of the president, then that trust should be allowed to function. And he does not think that trusts are inherently, in and of themselves, a negative or dangerous thing for America. And so he'll, like Standard Oil, for example, he has no problem with Standard Oil existing. Other presidents will not be so kind to Standard Oil and other monopolies or trusts, but we'll get there in a second. Presidents are also famous for the plans that they have. TR's is going to be named the Square Deal. One of his primary goals is going to be federal economic regulation, and he'll really get into this after he's been in office a few years. The Hepburn Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, these are really, really big key early reforms in the role the federal government has in business and in people's lives, and those all come under Theodore Roosevelt, so make sure that you understand those. Make sure you read carefully about those. Regulating natural resources, Theodore Roosevelt is definitely a friend of conservationists and preservationists alike. He established many national parks and preserves, and he worked with people like Gifford Pinchot and John Muir of the Sierra Club to establish ways to protect our natural resources and use them wisely if we're to use them at all. He strongly supported the National Reclamation Act of 1902, which established ways for Americans to conserve water. And this did illustrate, and I have a note here, the difference between preservation and conservation. Preservation is to save and really to not use. Conservation refers to wise management and some usage of natural resources. There is going to be a difference there. And now here we got a story about his personality. There are probably about a dozen stories that I could tell, but this one might be my favorite. So there comes a year, and I don't know if it's 1905, 1906, but there are some in America who are tired of Theodore Roosevelt establishing so many national parks and taking so many resources and so much land possibly away from business use. And so attached to an agricultural appropriations bill, there is a little clause, a little amendment, saying that the president cannot, on his own, establish national parks or add acreage to them unless Congress assents to it. Congress basically has to approve any addition to federally protected land. And of course, this would be a much harder fight than just the president sitting down at his desk and doing it. And so this puts TR in a pretty hard place. He can't not sign this bill. It's a huge bill, it's an ag appropriations bill, and if he doesn't sign it, he's going to create a lot of enemies for himself. But as soon as he signs it, he won't be able to protect any more land federally without Congress saying that he can do it. So you know what this guy does? He sits down, and over the course of, I don't know how many days, I don't know if it's a week or two, he sits down, he ends up putting 16 million additional acres under federal protection. He has people working around the clock. Anything that was in the works, any land that he was eyeballing for, maybe I should protect this, he goes guns blazing, 16 million new acres, and after making sure all of the paperwork is done, I'm not even sure if the ink is dry on this, he finally signs the Ag Appropriations Bill. People are so hopping mad when they find out what he has done. His opponents are just incredulous that he was able to put so much land under federal protection in national parks or otherwise. in such a short span of time, but that's really his personality. He does not take kindly to people telling him what to do, particularly if he thinks that it runs counter to national interests. He is at his heart a politician, and he will make concessions in just about every area, but he's not going to give up on what he holds most near and dear. And so I think The Midnight Forests, that story really is his personality in microcosm. If you're interested, you can Google it. I think it's pretty fantastic stuff. That's going to wrap up part 2. Stay tuned for part 3.